Judge Napolitano hits Jasmine Crockett with a fine. Her response makes him regret it. What happened in that courtroom that day wasn't just another political showdown. It was the kind of moment that would echo through history. Judge Andrew Napolitano, a 74-year-old former Fox News legal analyst turned federal judge, looked down at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with total confidence. He thought he had complete control. He thought he could silence her, but he was about to discover just how wrong he was. "You're out of order, Congresswoman," Napolitano declared, his voice echoing across the packed courtroom. "I'm fining you $500 for contempt of this court." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The room went silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every heartbeat feel loud. Crockett, a 43-year-old Texas Democrat and former civil rights attorney, slowly rose from her seat. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a fire in her eyes that no one could ignore. For the media and political insiders crammed into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Cameras whirred, reporters whispered, and security adjusted their stances. Everyone knew this hearing was important. It wasn't just about procedure or politics. It was about the future of voting rights in America, and what was about to unfold would shock the nation. The Protecting Voting Rights Act, the legislation at the center of this storm, had been hotly debated for months. Democrats wanted stronger federal oversight to prevent states from suppressing votes. Republicans argued it was government overreach. But beyond the politics, real people's lives were at stake, especially the voters Crockett represented in Texas, many of whom had been systematically disenfranchised through polling location closures, gerrymandered districts, and restrictive voting laws. Napolitano, in his mind, had this hearing under control. He had decades of experience, a courtroom that ran like clockwork, and a reputation for authority. Lawyers spoke when spoken to. Witnesses answered questions. Nobody challenged him. Not seriously, until Crockett. Crockett wasn't just prepared, she was armed. Her binder was thick with evidence, statistical analyses, sworn affidavits, internal communications. Every page meticulously documented patterns of voting suppression in her district. She had spent years in courtrooms across Texas, fighting for citizens who had been silenced. This wasn't her first fight, and she wasn't backing down now. When Napolitano tried to push her off course, insisting she stick to facts, not political rhetoric, Crockett didn't flinch. She opened her binder with deliberate precision and began presenting her evidence, case by case, statute by statute, illustrating patterns that were impossible to ignore. Polling locations closed without notice. Communities of color disproportionately affected. Internal memos revealing coordinated strategies. Every detail mattered, every fact backed by irrefutable documentation. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Republican members shifted uncomfortably. Democratic members leaned forward, sensing the moment was bigger than politics. It was history in the making. Media crews typed furiously, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Napolitano's jaw tightened, his confidence wavering. He had handled witnesses like this before, but never one who spoke with the precision of a legal expert and the fearlessness of a politician willing to stand up to power. And then it happened. Napolitano made the move he thought would end it all. He raised his gavel, and with that single authoritative motion, he tried to assert control. But instead of intimidation, Crockett's reaction was a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't nervous, it wasn't polite, it was the smile of someone who knew that she was exactly where she needed to be, armed with the law, with evidence, and with an unshakable sense of purpose. The $500 contempt citation hung in the air like a challenge. The courtroom, the media, and even Napolitano himself could feel the shift. What was supposed to be the end of her testimony had just become the beginning of a confrontation that would redefine authority, power, and the fight for voting rights. Crockett's voice broke the silence, calm, measured, yet infused with undeniable strength. "Your Honor," she said, standing tall, "I accept your contempt citation, but before we proceed, I have a few questions about the legal basis for this ruling." And just like that, the entire dynamic of the courtroom changed. What Napolitano thought would be a simple exercise of power had sparked a legal and political storm. Every eye was on Crockett, every mind was racing to process what was about to happen next. This wasn't a routine hearing anymore. It was the opening act of something historic. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was buzzing with an energy that was almost tangible. Reporters jostled for position, cameras balanced on tripods, and microphones reached over polished wooden benches. Security guards moved methodically through the marble halls, guiding a steady flow of lawyers, congressional staffers, and political operatives toward courtroom 12. Every step, every whispered conversation carried the weight of anticipation. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. It was a battlefield where history, law, and politics collided. At the center of this storm were two figures whose paths were destined to clash. Judge Andrew Napolitano, a man whose career had been built on authority, precision, and conservative legal scholarship, sat behind his imposing bench. Decades of experience had taught him how to maintain order, control the pace of proceedings, and assert power in every word and gesture. Napolitano's reputation as a meticulous, no-nonsense jurist preceded him. Lawyers and witnesses alike knew that any deviation from procedure could result in a stern lecture, or worse. But what made him formidable wasn't just his legal knowledge. It was his unwavering confidence. He believed that he understood the rules of the courtroom better than anyone, and he expected obedience without question. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her posture calm yet purposeful, a binder thick with evidence resting in front of her. At 43, Crockett represented a new generation of political fighters, young, fearless, and meticulously prepared. Unlike many politicians who relied on speeches and sound bites, she wielded the law as her instrument, dissecting statutes, precedent, and data with surgical precision. Her career as a civil rights attorney had been defined by high-stakes victories, from challenging gerrymandered districts to confronting police misconduct. She had spent years defending voters silenced by systemic obstacles, and now she brought that same expertise to Capitol Hill. The hearing was convened to examine the Protecting Voting Rights Act, a piece of legislation designed to restore protections gutted by the Supreme Court. The stakes were enormous. Voting rights were under attack in multiple states, and civil rights groups warned that new restrictions threatened to suppress historically marginalized communities. For Crockett, this wasn't abstract policy. This was personal. She had witnessed firsthand the consequences of disenfranchisement in Texas, where polling locations had been shuttered, voter rolls manipulated, and access curtailed. Every statistic, every case she would present in this room carried the weight of lived experience and meticulous research. Napolitano, in his mind, anticipated a straightforward hearing. Ask a few questions, ensure decorum, and maintain the image of judicial authority. But the dynamics were already shifting. The room's composition amplified the tension. Republican committee members leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Democratic members murmured quietly, aware that they were on the brink of witnessing something extraordinary. The press sensed it too. Journalists exchanged hurried texts. Live stream crews adjusted angles, all waiting for a single spark to ignite the proceedings. As Crockett began presenting her documentation, it became clear that this was no ordinary hearing. Her testimony was methodical, precise, and undeniable. She detailed patterns of polling closures, demonstrating how they disproportionately affected communities of color. She cited internal communications obtained through public records requests, analyzed statistical evidence, and referenced legal precedents that laid bare the coordinated nature of voter suppression. Every point she made forced the room to lean in, to consider not just the facts but their broader implications. Napolitano attempted to assert control, interjecting with warnings about staying factual and avoiding political rhetoric. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her calm, measured delivery exposed the contrast between his expectation of obedience and her readiness to challenge authority with undeniable evidence. The tension in the room became almost physical, as though the air itself was charged with anticipation. The stage had been set, a battle not of voices, but of legal skill, strategy, and unshakable conviction. By the time the first heated exchange erupted, everyone in that room knew the hearing would not follow the usual script. This wasn't procedural theater. This was a confrontation that tested not only legal boundaries but the very notion of power in a courtroom. The stakes were clear, one side defending entrenched authority, the other wielding the law as a weapon to protect the rights of millions. And as whispers traveled through the media section and committee members exchanged uneasy glances, it was obvious, whatever happened next, it wouldn't be forgotten. The high-stakes hearing was underway, and the world was watching. Judge Andrew Napolitano's presence in the courtroom carried more than just authority. It carried decades of carefully cultivated credibility. At 74, he was a figure many considered a titan of conservative legal thought, a man whose career spanned private practice, media stardom, and the federal judiciary. Before stepping onto the bench, Napolitano had been the go-to legal analyst for Fox News, explaining complex constitutional issues to millions of viewers with unwavering confidence. His nightly appearances on programs like The Ingraham Angle and Tucker Carlson Tonight made him a familiar figure in households across the country, his voice a symbol of certainty in an increasingly polarized media landscape. Napolitano's legal career was built on a foundation of elite education and rigorous professional experience. A Georgetown law graduate, he had served for decades as a superior court judge in New Jersey, where his colleagues described him as meticulous, demanding, and unflinchingly committed to the law. He authored several books on constitutional law, including Constitutional Chaos and The Constitution in Exile, works that earned him a reputation as both scholarly and formidable. For Napolitano, the law was more than a profession. It was a doctrine to be upheld with precision and, when necessary, with stern enforcement. His move from media to the federal bench, confirmed in the final months of the Trump administration, was seen by many as the perfect culmination of a conservative legal career. While his confirmation hearings were largely smooth, some senators expressed concern about the potential conflicts arising from his long history as a media commentator. Critics warned that Napolitano's frequent commentary on political issues might cast a shadow over his judicial impartiality, yet his meticulous record and legal acumen largely silenced the doubters. In the eyes of his supporters, he was the embodiment of judicial authority, knowledgeable, confident, and unafraid to make bold decisions. Those who worked closely with Napolitano painted a picture of a man who demanded excellence. Former clerks recounted stories of his legendary temper when legal reasoning was questioned, of his insistence that law be interpreted strictly, without deviation or compromise. One anonymous clerk described him as someone who didn't just believe he was right. He believed that disagreeing with him was almost a moral failing. Lawyers who appeared before him learned quickly that any attempt to circumvent procedure or present half-prepared arguments would be met with sharp correction. Napolitano's courtroom ran like clockwork. Authority was absolute, and anyone who challenged it did so at their own peril. Yet despite his reputation as a staunch conservative, Napolitano's relationship with the Trump-era GOP was complicated. He had publicly questioned some of the former president's legal strategies, criticized overreaches, and occasionally clashed with the very movement that had helped secure his position on the bench. This nuance, loyal to principle rather than party, made him an even more formidable figure, especially in a hearing where political optics were as important as legal precedent. Opponents couldn't easily frame him as biased. Supporters knew he would not bend the law to fit political expedience. By the time the voting rights hearing began, Napolitano was seen as the ultimate arbiter of authority. His presence alone was enough to command attention, and his reputation had preceded him into the courtroom. Lawyers, congressional staffers, and journalists all knew that when Napolitano spoke, it carried weight. Every word, every gesture was calculated to reinforce control, to remind everyone that the law, and he as its interpreter, was supreme. But reputation, no matter how formidable, is tested when confronted with someone equally prepared, equally fearless. Across the courtroom, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat ready with her binder of evidence, a formidable opponent in her own right. Napolitano's decades of authority, his carefully curated credibility, and his expectation of unquestioned obedience were about to collide with a legal mind trained to challenge systemic injustice and speak truth to power. And in that quiet, tension-filled courtroom, the stage was set. The judge's credibility would be his shield. But would it be enough when faced with a congresswoman determined not to yield? Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't just walk into that courtroom, she commanded it. At 43, she represented a new generation of political leaders, fearless, highly prepared, and unwilling to be intimidated by authority. Her story wasn't one of inherited privilege or political pedigree. It was the story of grit, determination, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Growing up in Missouri, Crockett worked her way through college and law school, carving a path that would eventually lead her to some of the most high-profile civil rights cases in Texas. Her career as a civil rights attorney quickly earned her a reputation as a legal powerhouse. She specialized in challenging police brutality, voting rights violations, and systemic injustices that others often deemed too risky or unwinnable. Crockett's victories weren't small. She secured a $2.8 million settlement against the Dallas Police Department for excessive force, and she successfully contested gerrymandered district maps designed to dilute minority voting power. Perhaps most notably, she represented college students arrested for voter registration activities, not only having their charges dropped, but exposing a coordinated effort to suppress student voting. These cases weren't just wins, they were public reckonings, exposing systems of power that sought to silence communities of color. Crockett's approach combined legal expertise with strategic brilliance. She didn't just know the law, she wielded it like a scalpel, cutting through bureaucracy and manipulation to expose the truth. Sherilyn Isle, former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, once said, "Jasmine doesn't just practice law, she wields it like a surgical instrument to cut through injustice." That reputation followed her when she ran for Congress in 2022, challenging a Republican incumbent in a district that had been redrawn to favor conservative voters. Political insiders watched in awe as Crockett not only defeated legal challenges to her eligibility, but used those attacks to mobilize voters, turning opposition into momentum. Her victory speech that night became iconic. "They tried to silence me in court, and we answered at the ballot box." It wasn't just a statement of triumph. It was a declaration that she would not be intimidated, that she would fight for her constituents by every legal and political means necessary. This combination of tenacity and intelligence quickly made her a force in COSO, Ingress, and she became known for her sharp questioning in committee hearings. One viral moment, her interrogation of a banking CEO about predatory lending practices, was viewed over 50 million times, signaling to colleagues and political opponents alike that Crockett's preparation and fearlessness were unmatched. What made Crockett particularly formidable was her ability to merge law and politics seamlessly. She understood that policy isn't just about legislation, it's about how laws affect real people, and she had spent her entire career ensuring that marginalized voices were heard. In committee hearings, she didn't rely on theatrics or partisan posturing. She presented evidence, statutes, and case law with precision, making even the most complex issues accessible and urgent. Unlike many politicians, Crockett didn't just memorize talking points. She memorized the law itself, every precedent, every clause, every nuance. By the time the Protecting Voting Rights Act hearing began, Crockett had already positioned herself as both an expert and an advocate. Her binder was more than a collection of papers. It was a meticulously organized arsenal documenting systematic voting suppression, statistical analyses, and affidavits from affected voters. She wasn't just there to testify, she was there to challenge assumptions, to hold powerful figures accountable, and to expose uncomfortable truths. Her combination of legal knowledge, political acumen, and fearless advocacy made her a unique and dangerous opponent for anyone used to unquestioned authority, even a judge of Napolitano's stature. Across the courtroom, observers could feel the tension. This was a woman who had spent her life fighting entrenched power structures, someone who had learned to stand tall when the odds were stacked against her. She was calm, collected, and unyielding, but every word she spoke carried the weight of experience and a promise that justice, no matter how uncomfortable, would be demanded. Crockett didn't just bring evidence. She brought authority, integrity, and the unshakable confidence of someone who knew how to win against the system itself. In that moment, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was more than a witness. She was a force of nature, a legal fighter whose presence alone set the stage for a confrontation that would be remembered for years. The courtroom wasn't just witnessing testimony, it was witnessing history. The hearing began with all the expected formalities: introductions, procedural motions, polite nods, and the soft shuffle of papers. But the calm, ordered rhythm of the courtroom was about to shatter. Judge Napolitano, confident in decades of courtroom authority, adjusted his robes and peered down at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, expecting the usual deferential witness. What he got instead was a storm wrapped in composure, a woman prepared to challenge not just his questions, but the very assumptions of authority itself. Napolitano opened with his trademark precision, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Congresswoman, you've made serious allegations regarding voting restrictions in Texas. I trust you have substantial evidence to back up these claims." It sounded routine, almost ceremonial, but Crockett's eyes didn't flicker. She leaned forward slightly, her binder open, her notes organized with surgical meticulousness. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I have extensive documentation of systematic voting suppression affecting over 200,000 voters in my district alone." The first sparks of friction appeared almost immediately. Napolitano, a man who thrived on order and hierarchy, issued a cautionary tone. "Please stick to facts, not political rhetoric." But Crockett was unshakable. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. She began presenting precise cases of polling stations closed without proper notice, each closure disproportionately affecting minority communities. As she cited statistics, referenced legal precedents, and read aloud internal communications from state election officials, it became clear this wasn't political posturing, it was meticulous, legally grounded exposition. Committee members shifted uneasily in their seats. Republican officials squirmed, sensing their narrative was being methodically dismantled. Democrats leaned forward, recognizing the emergence of something historic. Media crews scribbled frantically, aware that they were witnessing a rare fusion of legal brilliance and political audacity. Even Napolitano's own clerks were on edge, trying to keep up with the rapid-fire precision of her testimony. When Crockett outlined that 47 polling locations had closed between 2020 and 2024, with 89% in majority-minority zip codes, Napolitano interjected. "Correlation is not causation," he said, his voice a mix of warning and authority. Crockett didn't flinch. "Your Honor," she replied smoothly, "I'm presenting statistical analysis showing clear patterns of discriminatory intent supported by sworn affidavits and internal communications obtained through proper legal channels." The courtroom's tension tightened like a coiled spring ready to snap. For Napolitano, this was unprecedented. Witnesses in his courtroom generally adhered to strict protocol. They didn't interrupt, question, or challenge the judicial framework he had spent decades refining. Crockett did all three, and with impeccability. Legal reasoning. Every point she made was backed by evidence, every claim supported by precedent. She wasn't playing politics, she was presenting facts with undeniable force. The ideological clash became increasingly apparent. Napolitano represented the old guard, a steadfast defender of hierarchical order, cautious of overreach, wary of challenges to authority. Crockett embodied the new generation of activists in Congress, fearless, unapologetic, and willing to use her legal expertise to hold power accountable. The courtroom became a theater of ideals, each side presenting a vision for how democracy and the law should function. Napolitano demanded control and deference. Crockett demanded transparency and accountability. As the exchange escalated, the media sensed the story unfolding in real time. Camera lenses focused on every expression, every pause, every subtle gesture. Republicans muttered among themselves, uneasy at the force of evidence dismantling their talking points. Democrats watched with cautious excitement, recognizing that Crockett wasn't just testifying, she was rewriting the rules of engagement in real time. By the time Crockett reached the core of her argument, systematic suppression of voters through both legislative and administrative maneuvers, it was clear the hearing had transformed. What began as a procedural examination of legislation had become a showdown of ideals: order versus accountability, authority versus courage, tradition versus reform. Napolitano's attempts to assert control collided head-on with Crockett's methodical, unwavering pursuit of justice. In that charged atmosphere, every eye in the room understood. This wasn't just about voting rights legislation. This was a confrontation between two generations, two philosophies, and two interpretations of American democracy. The hearing had begun, but it had already become unforgettable. Each exchange, each pointed question, each rebuttal set the stage for a clash that would resonate far beyond the walls of the courtroom. And in that silence, punctuated only by the scratching of pens and the clicking of cameras, one truth was undeniable. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett wasn't just testifying, she was commanding history to take notice. The shift from tense debate to outright confrontation happened in an instant. One moment, Judge Napolitano was leaning forward, calmly insisting on tighter boundaries for testimony. The next, his voice cut through the air like a gavel strike. "Congresswoman Crockett, you are skirting dangerously close to political grandstanding. This is a legal proceeding, and I will not tolerate disregard for procedural rules. If you persist, I will have no choice but to cite you for contempt of court." The room froze. For a fraction of a second, the weight of those words hung heavy, the kind of silence that pulls oxygen out of the air. Contempt, an official accusation that could carry fines, even temporary detainment, wasn't just a procedural warning. It was a direct challenge to Crockett's credibility, an attempt to pull her out of the fight entirely. Most witnesses would have backed down. Most would have softened their tone, recalibrated their words, and tried to appease the bench. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat. Instead, she lifted her chin just slightly, eyes locked on Napolitano. "Your Honor," she began, her tone even but unyielding, "I respect the court and its procedures, but I also know my rights as a witness under oath and the constitutional obligation to speak truthfully, even when that truth is uncomfortable." Napolitano interjected, "This is not about silencing truth. This is about adherence to process." Crockett held up her binder, flipping deliberately to a tabbed section. "Process, Your Honor, is only legitimate when applied evenly. What I have presented today is directly relevant to the matter before us, the legality and constitutionality of voting restrictions in my district. My documentation, sworn affidavits, and statistical evidence meet the criteria for admissible testimony. If the court chooses to disregard that, then it risks appearing complicit in suppressing the very truth it claims to seek." A few gasps rippled through the gallery. Napolitano's brow tightened, not out of visible anger, but as though calculating his next move with precision. This wasn't a witness breaking down under pressure. This was a trained attorney countering a judicial threat with procedural jujitsu. "You are dangerously close to defiance," Napolitano warned, his voice quieter now, but edged with steel. "And you," Crockett replied without missing a beat, "are dangerously close to infringing upon a congressional representative's duty to defend her constituents' constitutional rights." The standoff was electric. On one side, decades of judicial authority backed by the institutional power of the bench. On the other, a freshman congresswoman whose legal acumen and political courage had fused into an unshakable shield. Crockett wasn't shouting, she wasn't posturing, she was speaking with the precision of someone who knew the rulebook well enough to use it against those trying to wield it as a weapon. Finally, she reached the core of her counter. "If Your Honor chooses to pursue a contempt citation, I will file an immediate motion to dismiss it on constitutional grounds, citing precedent from Watkins v. United States and Eastland v. U.S. Servicemen's Fund. Both establish clear limits on punitive measures against witnesses engaged in protected legislative oversight. I am prepared to do TC hat today." This wasn't just a defense, it was a calculated offensive strike. Crockett was signaling that any move against her would not only fail but could backfire spectacularly, creating a headline about judicial overreach rather than legislative accountability. The room felt like it might combust from the tension. Committee members whispered urgently. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Viewers watching the live stream leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something that might end up in law textbooks. Napolitano paused, then leaned back in his chair. His gavel didn't drop. His voice was measured. "Very well, Congresswoman, you may proceed, but you will stick strictly to material evidence." A subtle, almost imperceptible smile crossed Crockett's face. She had not only avoided the contempt trap, she had turned it into a moment that cemented her as the unshakable force in the room. The hearing continued, but nothing was the same. Crockett's counter had shifted the power dynamic. She was no longer simply testifying. She was dictating the terms of engagement. The bench, the committee, and the cameras now saw her not as a witness under scrutiny, but as an equal in the arena, one willing to challenge the very structures meant to keep her in check. And for the millions watching, it was clear, this wasn't just legal sparring, this was the anatomy of courage, broadcast live. The tension in the hearing chamber was already stretched to its limit. Crockett had just dodged the contempt trap with surgical precision, and everyone expected the proceeding to move forward under a fragile, uneasy truce. But that's when the unexpected happened, something that no one in the room or watching online could have seen coming. It started with a clerk sliding a sealed manila envelope toward Judge Napolitano. Normally, such exchanges are routine, legal filings, evidence packets, or procedural notes. But the moment Napolitano opened it, his entire demeanor shifted. The confident, composed former judge seemed momentarily unsettled, his eyes scanning the contents with rapid precision. The pause was long enough for cameras to catch it. Then, in a tone colder than before, Napolitano addressed the room. This court has just received new evidence that may alter the scope of today's proceedings. Congresswoman Crockett, I will need to ask you a series of questions pertaining to this material. The gallery buzzed. Crockett's team shifted in their seats, clearly caught off guard. Reporters leaned forward, as if they could somehow read the sealed documents from across the room. Crockett, keeping her composure, replied, Your Honor, I will answer any question relevant to the matter at hand, but I will also insist on reviewing any evidence before it is used to question my testimony. Napolitano hesitated for a split second, then nodded to the clerk, who handed her a copy. Crockett's eyes scanned the pages, and for the first time that day, her usually steady gaze flickered. This wasn't a document from her side. This was a leaked internal memo from a state elections board, one that appeared to contradict some of the statistical conclusions she had presented earlier in the hearing. The timing was surgical, almost too perfect, as if it had been held back specifically for maximum impact. Congresswoman, Napolitano began, this memo suggests that the data your team collected was incomplete, potentially misleading, and omitted key turnout figures from rural districts. How do you respond to this? Every camera in the room zoomed in. This was the moment the opposition had been waiting for, the chance to undermine her credibility in front of a national audience. Crockett took a slow breath. Then, without looking away from the bench, she spoke. Your Honor, this memo is not just flawed, it's weaponized. It cherry-picks data points to obscure the broader truth, and it comes from a source that has already been the subject of federal scrutiny for tampering with election records. The fact that it's appearing here, at this exact moment, tells me one thing. Someone is trying to use this hearing as a stage for disinformation. The room erupted. Committee members on both sides began talking over each other. Napolitano tried to gavel the chamber back into order, but the chaos had taken on a life of its own. And then Crockett went further, pushing past the safe procedural answer into dangerous territory. If this court is going to consider this memo, she declared, then we must also consider subpoenaing the authors, the commissioners who signed off on it, and every email, meeting note, and phone log connected to its creation, because I will not sit here and allow a political hit piece to be dressed up as judicial evidence. The statement was a grenade. Some in the gallery gasped, others cheered under their breath. Even the committee members aligned against her looked momentarily rattled. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a counterattack that threatened to drag a whole new set of players into the spotlight. Napolitano, visibly aware of the potential media storm, made the call. This matter will be reviewed. For now, we will recess for 30 minutes. The gavel came down hard. Instantly, reporters rushed for the exits to file their updates. Camera crews replayed Crockett's words on loops, and across social media, the hashtags began to explode. #Crockett Counterpunch, #Memogate, #Hearing Shock. But here's the real twist. The memo itself? By the end of that same day, independent analysts, TS Online had already begun picking it apart, exposing inconsistencies and errors. It wasn't the knockout blow the opposition thought it would be. If anything, it made them look desperate.